And with that, I'll turn it over to Reverend Dr. Lori Pound Fail, who can help move us into our next section.
Thank you, Dave. I have the honor of getting to introduce my dear friend, longtime friend, the Reverend Dr. Lisa Barnett. There's a lot of things about her that are you can find on the Phillips Theological Seminary website, which I'm going to share with you. And then I'm going to share some things you may not know about her. She's the assistant professor of American religious history and director of formation for disciple student at Phillips. She did her PhD work in the history department at Texas Christian University. Go
Go
Frogs!
Frogs!
Focusing on U.S. history since 1877 and specifically American Indian history and American religious history. She has 2 master's degrees from Bright Divinity School, go Bright, a master's of divinity and a master of theology degree in history. She is an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, one of our dear colleagues. She currently serves as a trustee for the Disciples of Christ Historical Society. She oversees the Isaac Errett Student History Paper Competition. And as David said, she is co-moderator of the Center of Indigenous Ministries. And we're so grateful that Crow and Lisa are our moderators. She's published, so I'm just going to share a couple of things. She has a paper that was published in the spring 2013 edition of the Stone Campbell Journal. She was the 2012 winner of the Isaac Errett Award that she now oversees. She's the author of 2 essays in the book on the history of Bright Divinity School that was published in 2011. She has a chapter included in Border Policing, a history of enforcement and invasion in North America, a very relevant chapter now, released by the University of Texas Press. She has a chapter on the, and Lisa, if I say this wrong, please correct me, Oto Church?
Oto, yes.
Yeah, of the firstborn that will be included in Religion in the North American West that will be coming out. It's forthcoming. She also has a chapter in another collection, Oklahoma Women Lead the Way into the KKK for American West between the World Wars, and that's also forthcoming. But the reason that we're here today is because of her book, Peyote Politics, The Making of the Native American Church, 1880 to 1937, which will come out this spring. We are beyond excited for all of the research and the wisdom that Lisa will share with us today. She is brilliant. She's gifted. One thing you may not know is she was a very sought after debate coach in the state of Texas. Before she decided, she had this pastor that kept encouraging her that she needed to become a pastor. And that happened to be me. So I'm going to take a little credit for where she is today. I am so pleased and grateful that you're going to get to learn from Reverend Dr. Lisa Barnett today. And Dr. Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I will blame Lori for everything. No. So let me see if I can first of all share, and then I'm going to have to move some stuff around here. Maybe. My computer is being really slow today. So hopefully you can see that book cover.
Yes.
If not, okay, just the book cover. So I am really thrilled that finally my dissertation revised is now in production with the University of Oklahoma Press and with their kind of reframing of the title, Peyote Politics, the Making of the Native American Church. It is scheduled to come out in May, although in the queue of production, they've said it could come out a little earlier, but you can pre-order on Amazon or with the OU Press. I'm thrilled that they got the image that I really wanted. This is a Woody Crumbo painting that hangs out at the Gilcrease, well, in production, the new building that's coming, but it's part of the Gilcrease here in Tulsa. An Oklahoma Native American artist, Citizen Potawatomi, depicting a peyote ceremony. And so I was thrilled when they got the rights from the Crumbo family to make this the cover of the book. While my book doesn't necessarily use the doctrine of Christian discovery as kind of a hermeneutical lens to examine the history of the Native American church, I think definitely when we get to that part later in the morning on the case study, we can kind of make the connection of how it arises. Now, the first few slides here are kind of word intensive, but I just kind of want to go through a few things that are there. My book actually uses the rise of Peyoteism, which is the religion practicing that uses peyote as an adjunct to the creator. But it examines the rise of Peyoteism and this Native American church. Time frame is really kind of late 19th, early 20th century. But I use it as a microcosm to explore some very controversial questions that are rooted in this question of pan-Indian identity around religious practice. Understand the larger social context. This is a complicated time for discovering notions about American identity and citizenship that, of course, many immigrants to the United States were also forced to have to navigate. But that extends as well to the consideration of Native Americans for citizenship status. And my apologies to those that might be in Canada that this is kind of U.S. American centered, although the Peyoteism does spread across the border into Canada, into Indigenous churches. Probably starting around the 1930s is when it really starts to make that kind of cross-border connection there. But in many ways, for U.S. Americans, immigrants, and Native Americans, there's this unofficial requirement of American Christianity, and particularly a Protestant version in American culture, that becomes sort of this qualification for U.S. citizenship. And that frames a lot of the controversy around this new Native American religion of Peyoteism that many, but not all, Native Americans are adopting. In fact, primarily when it's introduced, it's really kind of a minority religion among Native Americans. But I say that my work is kind of a social history, talking about political and legal events that surround Peyoteism, as well as a narrative of social identities centered on this controversy over peyote, particularly related to those terms Native and American. And so my purpose in the book is to try to historicize Peyoteism within a history of Indian country that sees both religion and spirituality as part of a broader political struggle. And understand, Peyoteism is political. It is bound up in political struggles over identity, over land, and certainly over sovereignty. And this contested cultural space of identity, with its racial, ethnic, and political dimensions, actually led peyotists to assess their own understanding of Native American identity and to preserve their religious freedom within the spheres of American democracy, which professed to value the First Amendment religious right to freedom, but didn't always practice that. So, here's where I get to what I argue in the book. I'm arguing that those Native Americans who were peyotists resisted an attempt to secularize their religious practice by actually using the American political and legal systems to ultimately incorporate in 1918 as the Native American Church in order to secure their religious freedom. But in doing so, they're also forming this sort of new hybrid cultural identity, namely Native American, that emphasized the real possibility of honoring Native identity as well as American identity on the path to citizenship status. And of course, this time period in the late 19th, early 20th centuries became there's a lot going on in society that I also tried to incorporate and to situate the historical context there. So the years for the book, 1880 to 1937, really kind of encompass federal and state efforts to suppress and prohibit the Native American use of peyote. 1937, for my work, is the last year that Congress tried to pass legislation to ban peyote. It's really not until 1965 that the federal government is able to act with an amendment to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that declares peyote a dangerous drug, and not until 1970 that the Controlled Substance Act lists peyote as a Schedule I hallucinogenic substance with a high potential for abuse. Totally false narrative around peyote. It is a mild hallucinogen, but it is not habit forming and addictive, and there are no recorded deaths of anyone ever using peyote, but yet by 1970 it ends up as a Schedule I drug. Again, kind of a change in federal Indian policy. That takes the afterword of my book, or the conclusion of the book there. But again, what I'm arguing is that through their tireless efforts to protect their religion within the legal and political system, Native Americans, many of whom, remember at this time, are not yet American citizens, but they're the ones that prove to be the true proponents of the constitutional idea of religious freedom. So just to give you a kind of example for the book, this is how the book is divided up, 3 parts. With a couple of chapters in each. So for the morning, I'm going to kind of quickly go really through the first 4 chapters on this idea of religious identity and racial identity and the controversy that surrounds peyoteism. So let's just kind of get started. And if you have questions along the way, write them down. You can also put them in the chat. We will have time after the small group discussion and the break this morning to come back for a larger kind of Q&A. So chapter 1 frames peyoteism as what I'm calling a new Native American religion in the United States of America. It actually has its roots, though, in Central and South America, particularly Central America, in Mexico, because part of the natural growth region is there. And a lot of indigenous tribes in Mexico practice peyoteism, still practice peyoteism, particularly the Huichol people there. But just to give you an idea, peyote is a cactus that has a natural growth region. As I said, we'll see some maps of that later. The buttons, the tops of the peyote cactus, those little things there, are harvested and dried for easy transport and shipping, and those are what are ingested. You can chew them. You can actually put them in hot water and make a tea. But peyote has always been considered a sacred medicine. Healing and medicinal purposes accompany this gift from the Creator. And so it has always been valued, as I said, a sacred medicine. Even when calling it a sacred medicine, it still confronts some controversy when it comes into the U.S. American context as a new religion. But again, it just sort of grows naturally and is harvested in kind of northern Mexico, South Texas. Here's the map of the natural growing region, and you can see early on at the time period what particular indigenous tribes in Mexico, as well as some indigenous tribes in South Texas, before removal to Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory, took over. Another map shows again this peyote growth region and how originally it encompassed a couple of parts of Texas over in the El Paso, West Texas area, as well as the Southwest area. Now, currently today, the primary region in South Texas actually is reduced down to 4 counties for a growth region that's available. And that's part of the concern today of why, with the cost and stuff with peyote, the supply, because once it became a Schedule I drug in 1970, guess what? all of that natural growth region in Mexico, you cannot transport it into the United States anymore because it's heavily controlled as a narcotic. But as I said, in Mexico, a lot of indigenous tribes began, who knows when, discovering the medicinal purposes of peyote and began a religious worship practice around it, particularly with the huicholes, which anthropologists have studied. It's a harvest and then a ceremony around the harvest with dancing, with songs. And of course, when Spanish explorers and priests began to infiltrate that part of what is now northern Mexico, they too became accustomed to seeing peyote ceremonies, and a lot of the Spanish chroniclers started documenting this plant as a medicine and as a worship. But by 1620, we get an edict out of the Spanish Inquisition against the use of the herb or the root called peyote that's been introduced in these provinces. It is an act of superstition, condemned as opposed to the purity and integrity of our holy Catholic faith. And so it is imposed upon us to stop this vice, to repair the harm, because it's part of this disobedience and suspected heresy. So even the Spanish Inquisition is trying to root out the use of this herb or this root that is called peyote, because it's been linked to superstition, heathen practices of worship. And that rhetoric gets picked up by federal Indian agents in the United States when it comes across the border with different tribes, and when the practice starts to change a little bit there. But so the Spanish Inquisition is trying to root it out. This comes from Daniel Swan's book, but you see the tribes in Oklahoma and Indian Territory that first start using peyote and that start the spread of peyote as it comes from Mexico into the United States, primarily through the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache tribes, and then up to the Cheyenne and Arapaho, and then it kind of continues to spread north. And then you can see from this map from Omir Stewart's book that it goes further north up into the Nebraska and the Dakota regions, and then even to the spread out west, particularly among the Navajo. You'll see some up in the Pacific Northwest as well. I had an opportunity to work with a cartographer to make a map for my book. So here's the grand preview of the map that Tom made for me, showing the natural growth region there in northern Mexico and South Texas, and then numerically the progression from the south up through the northern plains, again, starting with the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache, then to the Caddo, Wichita, Delaware, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and then further up to the north. It also went over kind of into the Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa areas as well, but I was only limited to one map with this depiction. So that's what made it there. As it came from the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache into that southwestern Oklahoma, now Oklahoma territory, it develops into its own unique American context ceremony. And primarily attributed to this is the Comanche leader, Quanah Parker, for developing what is called the half moon ceremony. One of the ways that it also changes when it comes to the United States is the outdoor spectacle of dance and everything is taken away. Now, all of a sudden, they are meeting in teepees, and you see the organization sitting in a circle with the fire, with the ashes, with a dirt altar built up, and a cactus of peyote that is placed on the altar. And so revered is the cactus. They call it grandfather peyote, and it sits atop an altar during the religious ceremonies as a reminder that it's a gift given by the Creator. And of course, within Native American cosmological worldviews, the plant itself is also seen as an ancestor, a living relative that helps bring balance and healing within the community. So that's why peyotists often refer to peyote with this familial sort of language of respect as a way to enforce their native identity. And people will sit in the circle. It is an all-night ceremony. It begins at sundown, typically now on a Saturday night, and concludes at sunup on a Sunday morning, with different times of the night for the ingestion of peyote, and then the prayers through drum and singing to help get people in touch to hear a word from Creator. Really fascinating. One of the first anthropologists in the late 19th century, James Mooney, who studied this, actually took these photographs that are housed within the National Anthropological Archives there. As it makes its way from the Kiowa and the Comanche, it starts to be introduced to other tribes in Oklahoma through intertribal visitations. And around 1880, a Caddo, Delaware man named John Wilson became familiar with peyoteism and starts to introduce some variations to the ceremony that differ from the half moon ceremony. Wilson, primarily with some Catholic faith in there, elongated the arms of the crescent altar, makes it much more of a horseshoe shaped, and adds this small dirt mound east of the fire to kind of represent the sun. So it starts to become known as the big moon or full moon, but big moon ceremony. And you start to see that straight east-west line from the entrance of the teepee to the altar now intersects with another line running north to south, and we get this creation of a cross. Wilson starts to add new songs to the ceremony and some concrete sort of ethical teachings, particularly around abstinence from alcohol, from gambling, as well as reducing the role of tobacco in the service. And he starts to introduce some Christian symbolism into the peyote ceremony that appealed to many who also became converts to his big moon ceremony, particularly among the Delaware, the Osage, the Wichita, Winnebago, Kickapoo, Omaha, and the Potawatomi. As it spreads further north into the plains, another variation starts to develop from John Rave and Albert Hensley, known as the crossfire ceremony. Rave continues to add more overt Christian symbols and meaning, and he's the one that kind of creates this crossfire ceremony that becomes much more recognizable by Native American Christians, and even whites kind of referred to it as the Indian form of Christianity. Banning the use of the tobacco, but also adding preaching, some sermons during the meetings, and even a little kind of baptism by peyote there, a lot of Christian texts. What is really interesting, a new element that comes from the Winnebago peyotists, both Rave and Hensley, is the presence of the Bible. And in fact, next to grandfather peyote on the altar is an open Bible displayed on that altar, again for kind of the enlightenment that comes from peyote in order to interpret scripture. And that primarily comes from Albert Hensley, who says that peyote opens the Bible to the understanding of the people. And that crossfire ceremony really takes off in the northern plains, the Chippewa, the Menominee, the variations of Sioux, Shoshone, Ute, Navajo tribal affiliations. And then you have other kind of interesting affiliations. The Osage Black Dog the second begins practicing a variation of Wilson's big moon peyoteism, but put some Osage symbols as well, the morning star on the peyote altar and lightning symbols on the teepee and changing of the altar. The Navajo, the V-Way, takes place in a hogun structure, right? Ceremonial space uses hot coals and ashes in kind of a V-shaped arrangement rather than the fire in the room. But this addition of Christian elements, you start to see the hybridization, some might call it syncretism as well, of indigenous views of Christianity combined with views of peyote that take place for a lot of tribes, not all, but many. And of course, the worship space is the tent, the teepee, unless tribes like the Osage that have had some money in the past to put up a much more permanent sort of structure there. Certain roles that develop in the American context of the peyote ceremony are the roadman. The roadman is not necessarily the mediator with the creator. The roadman is just the organizer of the ceremony. When someone in the community asks for healing, when someone in the community asks for a ceremony for protection, the roadman is the one who assembles everything together, making sure that the space is set up and certainly making sure that the supply of peyote buttons is there. You have the drum chief, you have to drum through the night with the singing. You have the fire chief to make sure that the fire is tended. And then one of the roles particularly designated for women is the water woman, because the creation stories of peyote are a woman and her child are lost in the desert wilderness, and in the middle of the night, an appearance of creator saying, take this plant, ingest it, and you will then find your way home and share this sacred medicine with your people. And so the water woman at night brings the water when you take breaks around the ingestion of the peyote, and stops the ceremony at sunrise with the break by bringing in the food for the celebration. So chapter 1 just kind of sets up a lot of this and the background of how it comes to the United States and becomes this new Native American religion. Chapter 2 now talks about how that becomes controversial. It becomes controversial because Indian agents start to notice the practice of this new American religion. And they start to notice that it becomes this sort of all-night ceremony. And they start to notice that when people stay up all night for a ceremony, they might not go to church on Sunday morning, and they might not get to the crops as quick as they need to after a nap or a break. And so you have this real struggle with what is American identity versus what is Native religious identity that now is starting to clash. And certainly a timeline here. Remember that before it was the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it was the Office of Indian Affairs in U.S. America. In 1883, they implement a religious crimes code. It's illegal to do a giveaway. It's illegal to have a sweat lodge. It's illegal certainly to do the ghost dance, the sun dance, any sort of dance and religious ceremony. And they're trying to include peyote in there. So in 1888, the Office of Indian Affairs makes peyote illegal. They try to declare it as an intoxicant. They're not as successful, though, in stopping it. Native people are still practicing and doing peyote ceremonies just outside some of their gays. Interestingly, in 1899, Oklahoma Territory officials tried to enact a law to suppress peyote use. That law is repealed in 1908, primarily because out of chapter 5 in the book, some of the court cases that push back on this territorial statute. By 1915, the Department of Agriculture is used to try to stop supplies of peyote from entering the country. 1917, the post office starts to prohibit the mailing of peyote shipments, but never mind, because we already have in structure railroads to be able to bring it to Oklahoma Territory and further north. But what I draw your attention to is this last one. The dates from 1916 through 1937, where specifically legislation is introduced in Congress to try to prohibit peyote use. And each one of those pieces of legislation are defeated, primarily because of allies, both James Mooney, an anthropologist, but also because of Native allies now in the U.S. Senate, particularly Oklahoma Senator Robert Owen. You also have some controversy. It's not just between whites, missionaries, and Indian agents and native peyotes, but you have some controversy within the Society of American Indians. This is a group that is formed in 1912 to really kind of be the voice for citizenship, the path to citizenship for Native peoples in America. It is primarily led by boarding school educated Native peoples. They have their own journal and their quarterly. But again, the goal of the society is to really push for citizenship status. In fact, this is an image that makes it into the book, portraying kind of the new modern era. And that's what the Society of American Indians is all about. The modern era of entrance into modernity for Native Americans. In doing that, to try to push for citizenship status, now the dichotomy, if peyoteism is being characterized as a religion for heathen, superstitious people, how do we want to grant citizenship status to that group of people? And so ultimately, what ends up happening is the Society of American Indians comes out opposing the peyote religion. And leading the charge to oppose it is one, Gertrude Bonnen. I don't know if I can get that off there. Let me go back to Gertrude Bonnen. Sorry, Gertrude Bonnen, also known as Sikala Saw, who is Yankton Sioux, boarding school educated at Carlisle, also serves in work out with the Navajo people on a reservation, but she is leading the charge to ban peyoteism among Native peoples. The biggest proponent for peyotes is the son of Irish Catholic immigrants, James Mooney. Mooney had just written a big work after anthropological study in the Northern Plains on the ghost dance, and comes to the Comanche Caddo Reservation in Oklahoma to do study on peyoteism. And that's where he gets introduced to the religious practice. In fact, again, he's one of the ones to take these pictures that are housed at the Anthropological Archives, and he's one of the first white individuals to be invited to attend a peyote ceremony. It will cost him dearly later when he starts to testify for the religious freedom for peyotes to use the practice. And anecdotal evidence also suggests that Mooney is the one who suggests, when they start to think about incorporating as a church, that they select the name Native American Church as opposed to the Society of American Indians, right? The controversy that's taking place there. And to put it in a larger context, when you read my book, this is also the era, too, of nativism, the anti-Catholic sentiment by native-born white Americans against Catholic immigrants coming over. And so he's kind of using that term native to kind of push back who are the real native people on this continent, right? In the next section of the book, this is kind of a really fascinating section around racial identity. Chapter 3 focuses really on the borderlands, the U.S.-Texas border. My book in border policing actually takes it from that border and includes the Canadian border there as well with that essay. But there is a commercial trade that develops around peyote because at this point it's not illegal to get it from northern Mexico. And so the supply is great, getting it to, though, the bordered lands of reservations. Laredo becomes the hotspot because at that time, Nuevo Laredo and the building of the International Bridge, as well as railroads that connect the two continents, or the two countries, is really prominent. And there's a policy of free trade across the border. There is no border customs, really. It's a duty-free during the Porfirio Diaz regime. There's kind of this duty-free trade across the border. You just have to declare what it is, but certainly very little tariffs that are taking place. This larger map, I'll break it down into a smaller section. As I said, 4 railroads intersect through Laredo, Texas, bringing it from the supply in South Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley area. Those green dots represent where I have documented specific peyote dealers. And these farmers go and pick from the natural region the peyote and take it into Laredo. And there's going to be some merchants in Laredo that are going to buy it from them or give them credit for merchandise in their store. And then it's these 2 merchant houses in Laredo then that are going to use the railroad system to ship it to Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory, and further north. And so my second map that Tom created kind of looks at, down in Laredo, the intersection of the railroads, but then he takes it a little further with the reservations in Oklahoma so that you can see how this commercial shipment of peyote takes place. They don't ship it directly to the reservations, but what ends up happening, they ship it to white drugstores next to the reservations, and Native people can go and purchase the peyote then from those suppliers. But out of Laredo, one of the biggest trading houses is the Joaquin Villegas and Brothers building. They become kind of the central hub there for the peyote trade, the Villegas family. There's another he was an employee with the Villegas trading house. He starts his own trading company. Julius Wormser and his brother also become merchants in the peyote trade down there in Laredo as well. This is a map I put together for my dissertation from the railroad lines, but you can see the different places in North Texas and across up through Oklahoma where I've documented again some drugstores that would sell peyote then to Native peoples. But of course, coming out of Mexico, it picks up this racialized sort of identity. And that becomes prominent when you read the chapter, either Border Policing or the book as well, how it gets framed in a very negative, stereotypical sort of way connected to Mexican people. And again, that's kind of a change as well with some of the federal policy around immigration that's taking place when suddenly we do have a customs and border policing that's going to limit the immigration from Mexico coming up into the 1920s and 30s. Chapter 4, though, I really find fascinating. I'm calling it Another Indian War, Race, Drugs, and the War on Peyote. One of the things that takes place from James Mooney's work, and I love this image that I found when I went to the National Anthropological Archives, is a map from 1897 inviting Mr. Mooney to a peyote ceremony. Mooney is the one, though, that is kind of credited with accidentally calling peyote mescal because the two cactuses are somewhat similar. Not enough, though, they're very different with the physiological effects from ingesting them. But he calls it mescal, even though it's really peyote. So this is a map for him to get to the mescal teepee in order to get, to be a part of the ceremony. But that term mescal is what later is going to help overturn some of the federal court cases and the statutes because it's been incorrectly identified. But as it becomes more known to Indian agents and missionaries, right, who want to stop the practice, they are trying to link it to being an intoxicant. And so here are some of the headlines. Visions, the They're trying notice the pointing out of the mescal bean. They're trying to eliminate this poisonous bean, is what they're calling it. And the Indian office is making war on the peyote drug connected, but it comes from a mescal bean, which is not connected with the mescal cactus. But notice the rhetoric of peyote now as a drug. First of all, they tried to link it to the same intoxicating effects as alcohol. This is, you notice the Indian, the stereotypical sort of drunken Indian that kind of starts to emerge in the late 1800s with some of the drawings like you see here. But notice this cartoon from 1913 on the jug is substituted peyote. So we're trying to make it an intoxicant like alcohol because we're trying to ban alcohol in the United States at this time. But Native peoples are not able to get any sort of significant legislation around making it as an alcohol. It kind of becomes known as dry whiskey with the Indian agents and the missionaries, but it's not enough to get it banned. So the next strategy is to turn to two federal laws, the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act and the 1914 Harrison Narcotic Act, because guess what? We have a problem in U.S. America with narcotics and opiates, primarily among white people, right, that started after the Civil War, but there is a drug problem in America. And so peyote at this time period starts to get likened to three particular drugs. It starts to get, the effects of peyote, say some, are just like opium, marijuana, and cocaine. Opium, marijuana, cocaine, remember those. But the headlines now, new dope craze, hashish. I love this last one. Peyote used as a drug in the Indians' cult of death, part of this new religious movement. So the Indian office is now going to make war on this peyote drug, right? We're going to buy the supply at Laredo and destroy it. Uncle Sam is going to wage the war on this Indian dope to free Native peoples from this slavery, again, of the mescal bean. And not only is it a war on this peyote drug, it's a religious war now to help, right? A religious war in this narcotic used by Natives in their religious rituals. Thank you, Tulsa World in 1921. So what I started piecing together from the framing of peyote with opium, cocaine, and marijuana, and documented by Doris Marie Provine, is this early racialized war on drugs in the early part of the 20th century. Cocaine associated with blacks, particularly black men in the American South. Marijuana associated, obviously, with Mexican. And opium associated with the Chinese. And remember, 1882, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act that keeps getting renewed, right? This anti-Chinese sentiment. And so her chapter there talks about those three in this early racialized war on drugs. And so I'm making the claim that this is an attempt then to bring peyote into this early racialized war on drugs to secularize the sacred medicine in order to legislate it out of existence and the religious practice associated with it. And so again, the headlines, the peyote god versus Christianity. And that's how it gets framed with missionaries and Indian agents in America. It's an either-and situation. You either use peyote as part of your religious practice or you're not Christian. So it's this idea of what is really religion, right? And how do we regulate some of that religion as well? But not only that, there are other aspects of the religious ceremony that Indian agents particularly want to critique. The time devoted to the ceremony. If your all-night ceremonies last, you are going to have these demoralizing effects that will encroach upon the time that should normally be devoted to work. It would seriously interfere with the progress of Native peoples by having them, practice a ceremony all night, not go to church on Sunday, and certainly not tend to their crops in the fields in a work sort of ethic, probably kind of along the lines of Max Weber's, the Protestant work ethic. We're really starting to see this at this time period with Native peoples. So again, I'm just sort of highlighting some of the points that go kind of through the different chapters that I'm writing about. Oh, and I'm going to end the show there, and I'm going to stop the share here. Again, I've kind of, traveled through it rather quickly. I thought I would go a little longer there, but I didn't. That's just sort of highlighting some of those early chapters. What I think is really interesting too, I'll back up, the change from northern Mexico to the United States. Notice we go from an outdoor ceremony to sitting in a teepee, right? On a reservation where Indian agents are watching your every move. So we've moved it from an outdoor visible to an indoor where you have to be invited sort of ceremony. And this is what's really interesting about peyote, because dance is such a part of Native culture and Native experience, the sun dance, the ghost dance, that physical. But for peyote worship, the dance is gone from the Huichole's ceremony to the Quanah half moon ceremony, and then the big moon and crossfire ceremonies. No dance, so as not to draw attention to the ceremony. Again, that kind of gaze of the Indian agents and the missionaries. Remember, this is a time too where missionaries are on each of those reservations and watching and trying to promote Christianity. So unfortunately for Western white folks, it becomes kind of this competition with Christianity. And so part of that is to try to root out any sort of competition, religious practice that they deem unchristian. Even with the Christian elements as part of the ceremony, it's not Christian enough, if you will.